Hey guys, welcome. Thanks for being patient with standing room in the back. I want to introduce our speaker today. Tim Mehta is an analytics and conversion optimization strategist at Portent here in Seattle. He subscribes to the idea that using design and copy to empower users will always yield the best long-term result for any brand. He's originally from Orlando, Florida, and admittedly eats avocado toast every morning. Verified. Please help me welcome Tim to the stage.
Se enredan mis dedos, me abrazan, su risa me llena de miedo.
I got them Gucci snakes on when I'm jumping at the phantom. Got the syrup and the Jolly Ranchers mixing in the fender. I might pull up going ghost. You could call me Danny Phantom.
What's up, everybody? Oops, that was a quick one there. Yes, everything Colin said is true. I'm an analytics and conversion optimization strategist at Portent here in Seattle. I'm really glad to see you guys today. It's awesome. This room is fully packed, which is great. Interesting, though, the Snapchat guys are actually speaking right now as well. But fun fact about that, once he gives that talk once, it disappears forever. Very on brand for Snapchat. So yes, today we are going to be talking about friction. But we're not just talking about friction. We're going to talk about everybody in this room and how you can use friction to optimize the experience for your users or even yourself. Now, as cliche as it sounds, everybody in here is the designer of the future. You're the architects of the future for your users. Speaking of that future, I want everyone in here to think and imagine what the ideal future of design is to you. I'm going to give you two scenarios of that future. The first scenario is a future where designers are optimizing for solely conversions. The other future is a future where designers are optimizing for the user. So by a raise of hands, who here believes in future number one, a future where designers are optimizing for conversions? There's some. Cool. There's another. What about future number two, optimizing for the user? See a raise of hands. Awesome. So new Washington state law, hand raises at conferences are legally binding now. So gonna hold everybody in here to that. So yes, what is friction? Friction is really anything that just gets in the way of the goal of a user. But we know friction. Our users know friction very well. They manipulate it all the time. Think about you're going for a walk and you see a puddle. You walk around the puddle. You're reducing friction to improve your experience. Or what about the flip side? You're going for a jog. It's a really hot day, but you see some sprinklers in somebody's lawn. So you go off of your path, run through the sprinklers, get back on your path. You're adding friction to improve your experience. So we and our users, we know friction. We use it all the time. But as designers, or as anyone who is designing an experience, UX professionals, anything, it's really important that you have a deep understanding of friction. Because as children, the general person's not taught to constantly evaluate the experiences they're going through. They're not taught to look for the friction. So it's your job, it's your creed to know this. So we're going to talk about types of friction, how to find friction, how to fix it, how to communicate friction, friction that's used to manipulate, and then how you might even need to be adding friction to your experiences. So 5 types of friction. These aren't the only 5 types of friction. These are just 5 types I want to talk about. The first one is making users think. So this includes things like laying out options with no labels, hyperboles, vague messaging, or even inconsistent messaging. The first example is something I came across on my bus ride into work one day. If you can't read that, somebody keyed the word stolen into this car. Awesome use of labels. Now for us, that's like, oh, that car's stolen, that's crazy. But from a friction standpoint, if I'm a police officer and I come across this car, this label has reduced a lot of friction for me. I don't have to think, oh man, like did someone abandon this car? Like if you're a cop or police officer, sorry, and you come across this vehicle with no label, a lot of things go through your head. You have a lot more thoughts as opposed to it saying stolen. When it says stolen, the cop says, oh, that's me. I know what to do here. It's my job. So a great example of, don't key these into cars anyway, but a great example of labels to fix friction. Next example is a coffee machine we just got at work. So this is like a really bougie coffee machine. It's got, I think it's Stumptown, but it's got really cool names like Hairbender and Trapper Creek. But we made a startling discovery after 1 week. Trapper Creek is decaf. Imagine the friction someone went through drinking decaf coffee for a whole entire week and not even realizing it. That's a great example of not using labels correctly as a part of friction. So the next example is from our friends at Dropbox, hyperboles. Hyperboles suck. I hate hyperboles. Do you want to know why? Because they don't actually tell the user anything. They just create more questions in the user's head, making them think. So how are you the best? Why are you the best? In reality, you're just kind of talking yourself up, but that's not valuable to the user. It's not useful. So let's look at an example. Let's rearrange some of the copy in the subheadline. Let's remove some stuff, and let's see how we can do this better. Loved by over 500 million users. If I'm a user and I come to this is helpful. This is valuable. This is social proof. All we did was just rearrange some things from the subheadline and threw them up there. But this is an example of headlines, vague headlines or hyperboles as friction. The next example, my wife is pregnant. She's due in a couple weeks, so hopefully I don't get a phone call while I'm on stage. But if I do, you know why. We're looking for a baby moon. So like a couple's massage, that sounds really nice. And we come across this, the Sky Suite. Sounds awesome. But then I looked at it again, and I noticed something. 1 hour, 50 minutes long. So traditionally 1 hour is 60 minutes, but I guess in the Sky Suite, time moves faster. So we actually didn't engage with this specific spa because of that, because the inconsistent messaging. You lose your user's trust when you say one thing and then you say something completely different right away. The next example is a region of a homepage. So we just took a part of the homepage, took a screenshot. Going with that indirect messaging and hyperbole is a little bit mixed. I'm not going to tell you what MuleSoft does because MuleSoft doesn't even tell you what they do. Connect anything, change everything. Okay. If I'm visiting this site for the 5th or 6th time and I'm already familiar with what MuleSoft does, this might have some emotional impact on me. It might work. But can you really afford to only cater to the people who are visiting your site for the 5th or 6th time? No, you can't. You have to understand that there are people coming to your site or to your experience for the first time and make sure that they know what you do. The other point of friction on here is actually the CTA. And it's kind of hard to see, but it just says learn more. Learn more what? Learn more about connecting anything? Learn more about changing everything? Again, a user has to think before clicking that button because you're not telling them what happens when you do. So let's do the same thing. Let's see how we can do this better. Create applications, connect everything. So what MuleSoft does is it's a platform for developers to create applications and then share them, kind of like a social network for applications. It's actually pretty cool. But if you're a user for the first time, you didn't know that before. This would help you understand that right away. It's the CTA. When you clicked on that button, you go to an integrations page. So learn more about integrations. This is a great example of how you can reduce friction just by telling a user exactly, just being more direct with users and not beating around the bush or giving out hyperboles and things like that. So that's the first type of friction, making users think. Second type of friction, distractions. Just by using this slide, this is a distraction for everyone in this room because you're probably looking for Waldo and not listening to what I'm saying. And that's okay. That's okay because we purposely did this. We wanted to show this as an example of how distractions or friction can improve an experience. It can make it fun. That's the point of things like Where's Waldo and puzzles. You're adding friction to improve an experience. So for everyone who's looking for Waldo, I'll give you 5 seconds. Can someone bring a water up, maybe? Sorry. Okay, time's up. Thank you. There's Waldo, found him. So while you can use distractions to improve an experience like this, of course, there's a lot of negative friction that can happen because of distractions. The first example is specifically an irrelevant association. Imagine you go to a hat website. The sole purpose of this hat by the way, I built this site on PowerPoint. It's a really good CMS for any designers out there. So imagine if you're a hat website, your whole purpose is to sell hats and nothing else. That's all you want to do. You want to give your customers awesome hats. But if you're using something like this as your featured image, you're creating very irrelevant associations compared to what you want your users to do or what they want to do. So it's important to understand your users' current associations, especially strong ones like this. Another point of friction on here is actually making users think, under top hats, none of those hats are actually top hats. So that's my bad for when I designed this site. The next example of a distraction is an ad I came across on Instagram. So when I first saw this, I'm like, damn, Amazon really knows me, like really well. But then I noticed it's not a big bag of weed. It's actually little bushes that you use in figurine sets like train sets. Pretty cool. But again, they served this. This is a very irrelevant association. Even for people who are interested in little bushes like that, they might think of something else. So even with your advertisements, when you're targeting things, make sure that the creative is not creating associations other than what you're trying to sell or trying to say. So distractions, that's the second type of friction. The third type of friction is eye strain. You might recognize this meme. So this one we're not going to spend too much time on because I know there's a lot of designers here today, and this is actually the easiest type of friction to spot because you can feel it. Your users physically have a change in their eyes when you have eye strain. This includes things like harsh transitions, poor contrast, or tiny little text when you're trying to, read on a mobile device. We're only going to look at one example, and again, it's our friends from Dropbox. Watch the colors. So it doesn't get better, trust me. So Dropbox, again, if anyone from here works for Dropbox, I should probably buy you a beer or something after this. But I'm actually nice to you compared to the ones you'll see in a minute. So this is a very harsh transition. Okay, you're causing your user to read dark background, light text, and then going back and forth between the other way around. This is not good for your users. It's not only eye strain, it's a distraction, and it actually might cause some people to get a little nauseous. Again, only example for eye strain because that's an easy one to spot. The next type of friction is time. This puppy is waiting for its owners. No, not its owners, its roommates. Its roommates to come home. It's waiting. This is the most common type of friction we probably come across and also very easy to identify. Kind of like when you're waiting for a website to load on your mobile device. Funny thing about this is that Facebook prides itself on lazy loading or progressive loading, unless you don't use their app. If you go to their site on your mobile browser, they don't really care. Another example of time or waiting as friction is waiting in line. So if you're at the airport or Disneyland, like Colin mentioned, I'm from Orlando, so this hits close to home, waiting in line, especially in Florida, you're sweating, close to a bunch of strangers, and you have to put your phone in a locker because you're going on a roller coaster and you have nothing to do. This is one of the biggest opportunities as far as fixing friction, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But time can actually improve an experience. It can be good friction. Think about Thanksgiving, right? Imagine if you came to Thanksgiving dinner and then you just sat down and ate and left. That's not the experience you're hoping for. It's not the one you enjoy. You need that time and anticipation to build the smell of all the different turkey or mashed potatoes or green bean casserole. You need that because it builds excitement. It creates anticipation. And of course, you don't want to make people wait too long, so there's always a threshold when you're using time as friction to improve an experience. But when you do, that payoff at the end is that much better. Like a lot of chefs say, time is the best recipe. Same thing goes for friction. Just don't make them wait too long, because then they're going to be mad. So that's time, fourth type of friction. Fifth type of friction is too much novelty. So this one's not as simple, but Google Glass is an example of a brand or product that used too much novelty in product adoption. This also includes things such as complex ideas, presenting them to your user way too quickly. But I want to talk about Google Glass first because it's a very common theory that Google Glass did not get the product adoption it wanted because it was too new, too unfamiliar to people. So let's look at the right way as far as product adoption goes of creating a product. The smartphone, of course. Heuristically, which in other words means instinctively or what we're familiar with, we already knew how to use the smartphone when it came out. We knew how to use a phone. We were used to holding things up to our head. Then the mobile phone came out. We're used to carrying things in our pocket. And then the same thing for the music. So Walkman, used to carrying our Walkman around, CD player, eventually the iPod and the iPod Touch. So when the smartphone came out, we already knew how to use it. This is an example of how when you're designing or developing a product, to keep the user's heuristics in mind. What are they used to using? So let's look at this same model for Google Glass. All right, glasses, awesome. I'm wearing glasses. A lot of people here wearing glasses. Heuristic 1, check. Smartphone, yes. Most of us use smartphones. Browse the internet, check. Heuristic 2, we know how to do that. Iron Man's user interface inside of his helmet. If you're not Tony Stark, this is not a heuristic for you. This is a big part. We're not used to having a little screen in front of our eyes constantly. We're not used to using it to browse. We like having the option to turn it off and on. So this is an example of understanding your user's heuristics before you present something that's going to be way too much friction for them to even want to engage with. Another example of too much novelty is complex ideas. So Bitcoin is not necessarily simple for everyone in the world yet. There's still a lot of people who don't understand it. If you go to bitcoin.com and you're one of those people, you still don't understand it. They present so many different complex ideas. They actually add layers beneath what Bitcoin generally is. Bitcoin wallet, Bitcoin pool, Bitcoin mining. If I'm a user who doesn't know about Bitcoin and I come to this site trying to, I'm probably going to say, never mind, and go on with my life because it's too much novelty, too much complexity for me right away. So how can you do this right? Well, Bitcoin.org, my .org homies. This is a way to do it right. Bitcoin.org understands that it's not necessarily a well-adopted idea yet. A lot of people still don't completely understand it. So if you're a new user and you come to this site, you understand it right away with very little distraction. You even have a little media button if you want to watch a video to learn more about Bitcoin. Even if you're an existing user of Bitcoin and you do understand it, this doesn't cause any friction for you. You know where to go. So an example of how to not have too much novelty when presenting complex ideas. So those are 5 types of friction, not the only types, but the types we're talking about today. But now I want to talk about how to find friction. Finding friction is all about having a mindset, being an active skeptic. What is this? Why is it here? Why is it designed that way? Does that make it better or worse? So the best way to find friction is to constantly evaluate the experiences you're going through, called being an active skeptic. What is this? Why is it here? Does that make the experience better or worse? If it makes the experience better, awesome, great, learn from it. Take that same concept or principle, apply it to the future of your designs. If that makes the experience worse, reach out. We are in the era of speaking up. See something, say something. This is the difference. This is the new habit that I want everyone in this room to form. What's the worst that can happen? You reach out and they don't listen to you, nothing. But it can add a lot of value to those designers. Here's an example of being an active skeptic in the real world. I'm in the backseat of a car and I want to open the AC vent. But the way it's designed does not help communicate what's open or what's closed. What's this for? AC vent. Why is it here? So people in the backseat finally have some control over something. But does that make it harder or does it make it easier? It makes it harder. I have to hold my hand up so I know which is open and which is closed. You're adding friction to an experience. So let's look at an example of finding friction. We're going to look at a homepage, general run-of-the-mill homepage, big hero image, CTA. And I'm going to give everyone in this room about 10 to 15 seconds to find any of those types of friction we just talked about. So 15 seconds is a really long time to stand on stage in silence. So I'm gonna jump down for a minute and let you guys look at it. You can't see it. Okay. Has it been 15 seconds yet? I think it's only been 2 minutes. Shit. Okay. So what I want everyone to do is, to themselves, compare what you found to what I found. All right, I'm going to go right for it. I'm not going to hesitate. The croissant. This is a distraction. A croissant has nothing to do with FreshBooks. It has nothing to do with the message FreshBooks is trying to send. It just makes you hungry. Next thing that I found here was the cactus, another distraction, a little bit of eye strain, to be honest. It's smack dab in the middle of the view, and it has probably the highest contrast of any element on that page. I think someone at work has it, but again, totally irrelevant to what FreshBooks does or the message it's trying to send. The text on the side of this book. You can almost read the text, and that is a problem because a lot of people, I bet, are turning their heads and zooming in, trying to figure out what books are FreshBooks reading. Again, it has the word book in it, but it has nothing to do what FreshBooks does or the message they're trying to send. The cheese next to the croissant. Oh, sorry, those are Post-it notes. Because of my association with the croissant, I thought that was cheese, so I don't really need to say more about that one. So let's talk about eye strain here. So they have a little call out, and it's violating a lot of design rules in general. It is angled, it's bold, it's also italicized, it's blue, it's got big text and then little text. Usually numbers are really impactful with users, right? Like 97% of people, are happy with this. That's great. But when you create extra friction for someone to be able to read something like that, they're most likely going to skip it. Another point of eye strain here are the terms of service and safety security guards, or let's call it a privacy policy. They're so tiny. And I'm sure a lot of designers here know, when you make something tiny, it's because you don't want people to read it. Users understand this. So again, it's eye strain, but it's also making people think. Why do I have to read a privacy policy and a terms of service just to give you my email address? That makes me wonder what the hell you're going to do with my email when I give it to you, if I have to read these things just before that. So again, they're not reducing anxiety or friction here, they're actually adding it. The next thing we noticed, the colleague actually pointed this out to me, it's a new concept, orphaned keywords. So when someone lands on your site, you want them to understand what you do right away, very quickly. When your keyword, in this case, accounting software, is orphaned, or in other words, on two different lines, it does take a little extra effort for the user to read it. Now, this is a small point of friction, but it is still friction. So while it's important to be an active skeptic, it's also important to be humble. We just made a ton of assumptions, or at least I just made a ton of assumptions. You guys are off the hook. We don't know FreshBooks users. We don't know the data. Maybe that croissant improves conversions. We have no idea. So it's important to be humble. Make sure you understand your user base before you start to assume what their friction is. A good way to remember is this. Your friction might be someone else's function. So what you perceive as bad, they might actually find useful. A really good example of this is actually from the 1950s. General Mills released a cake mix under the brand name of Betty Crocker. And this cake mix was actually revolutionary because it took all the ingredients that you would usually use for cake, so the eggs and the milk and everything else, all condensed into a powder. All the cook had to do, or all the consumer had to do, was mix this with water and then bake it. Out comes a delicious cake. Think about all that friction that was just reduced. They don't have to go to the store to get eggs. They don't have to go to the store to get milk or pay for either one of those things. From a product developer standpoint, this is a shoo-in. This is going to be a hit, and I probably would have thought the same thing because that's a lot of friction being reduced. But that's not how it turned out. Consumers did not like it. They didn't buy in. Why? They couldn't figure out why, what was happening. So psychologists, as they usually do, figured out why. It was guilt. Whenever the consumers would serve this cake to their guests, the guests would say things like, "Oh my gosh, this cake is delicious. You must have spent hours over, cooking this and making this." Remember, it's the 1950s. So this is a very important kind of identity thing with them. So The consumers felt like frauds. They felt like they were getting all this credit for doing something so great, and they really didn't have to move much of a finger. They just had to mix. So they stopped buying it. The takeaway from this example is to understand your users. Know what is their function versus their friction. Like I said, that croissant might be improving conversions. It might not be reducing conversions or adding friction. So very important to understand the expectations of your users as well. Let's talk about how to communicate friction. And I know a lot of designers in here today have trouble just communicating ideas to higher ups in general because they're not in the weeds like you are. They don't know what's going on. The example we're going to use is close to home. It's from Microsoft here in Seattle. Who here knows about Azure, has worked for Azure, or uses Azure? Oh, wow. Actually, I'm not surprised. So Scott Guthrie was in charge of Azure in its early days. He works for Microsoft. Scott found a problem. When users were using Azure to create applications, so developers use Azure to create applications for those who don't know Azure, when they were doing it, they were having a lot of friction. They were having a lot of trouble. It was tough. Whenever Scott tried to communicate this friction to his higher-ups at the time, it fell by the wayside. It just wasn't a priority to them. They could not see what Scott was seeing. So Scott had an idea. He invited all of his senior managers and all the senior developers to an off-site meeting. He sat them down, and he asked them to use Azure in the same way that their customers do to build an application. In short, it was a disaster, which is exactly what Scott wanted. They could not seamlessly build an application using Azure. So Scott finally got his point across. That's what it took. He had to make them trip over the truth for themselves before they actually believed him and bought in, and then he got the support he needed. So when you put your senior management or whoever you're trying to communicate this to, when you put them through the pain, that's when you get that empathy that wasn't there before. That's when you get that understanding, and that's when you're going to get buy-in. So this example is from the book Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. If you have any hand in creating experiences, regardless if you're a designer or not, I highly recommend this book. It talks about heightening and just optimizing or maximizing. That's a lot of misings, sorry. It talks about improving the moments that you create for people and how to make them memorable. Really good book, the only book I recommend in this talk. So let's talk about fixing friction. But there's a little bit of a caveat here because there's a lot of friction in the world we can't fix right away, such as loading times. And I'm sure a lot of developers here know that. Loading times are not something you could just fix with the flip of a switch. But you can treat the symptom of friction, and that can be considered fixing it. So let's go to loading times. Who here plays FIFA? Okay, some people, Jesus Christ. I was gonna say, FIFA's a really fun game. So instead of when the game is loading, usually you see like a blank screen, just a little ball spinning, something boring. But FIFA understands this friction. They let you play while the game loads. When you give the user something to do, especially something fun, while they're waiting, not only does it make waiting less boring, but the perceived pain of waiting is greatly reduced or sometimes totally eliminated. Sometimes people are upset that it's done loading because they were having so much fun playing while it was loading. Another example of making waiting less boring or fixing friction is Slack. I love Slack. I've got Slack socks. Got them on the Slack website. I'm all slacked out. But they give you, while Slack is loading, little fun, uplifting messages. They also give you useful messages. How you can optimize your experience using Slack gives you useful tips. So not only entertaining people while they wait, but giving them something useful for what they're about to experience, something that can, again, maximize their experience. The next example is one of the earliest examples of making waiting less boring. Elevators. Elevators were painfully slow back in the day, and probably just as awkward as they are now. But then a genius came around, I wish I knew their name, and they had an idea. Elevator music. I take this very seriously, you guys. Awesome example, very early example of making waiting less boring. treating the symptom of friction. Who here watches Glow on Netflix? All right, more than play FIFA. That's awesome. Glow is about a group of women who start their own wrestling federation. But they had a problem. People were falling asleep during their shows. They were tired, or maybe they were bored. Debbie, who's a producer of the show, in this scene has an idea. She hands the director a box of nerds. She says, "Give them this before the show. So let's pump them full of sugar so they can't be tired." This is a genius example of treating the symptom while they work on the bigger problem. The next example is from our friends at Pocket. Who here takes the bus to work? Yes, I take the bus to work every day. I like to do a lot of reading on the bus as far as, all the articles I've bookmarked throughout the week. But sometimes I go through dead zones, so zones without service on my phone, especially coming into Seattle. And when I'm going in between articles, or if I'm going from page 1 to page 2 of an article and I lose service, that's friction for me because that really disrupts my pattern of consumption, my learning rhythm that's going on. Pocket understands this friction, and they fix it. When you bookmark something to Pocket, it saves it on the app. Therefore, if you're going through a dead zone, you can still read your articles. If you're flying on a plane, you can still read your articles. If you're on the moon, you can still read your articles. So Pocket understands this friction, gives you a way to work around it. They also understand something which I'm hoping more product designers or just people who create experiences in general keep in mind: accessibility. There's friction we can't control for individuals as well, things like visually impaired. So Pocket gives you the option to read whatever article you saved, read it to you out loud. This is really important to think about, especially when designing something for digital, because there's people out there who have color blindness, dyslexia, or they're visually impaired, and a lot of other things that have a lot of friction with the ways things are done as the norm. So it's important to keep them in mind. Let's look at an example of fixing friction, specifically reducing friction. This is a real-life example we did. So we have a client in Canada called Enercare, and they sell heating and cooling services, things like air conditioning and furnaces. We were tasked to improve the landing page experience. So this page was for a user to come and buy a furnace. You can see a lot of friction right off the bat. Things that we noticed. That hero navigation on the right, totally unnecessary because if a user wanted to get around, they could go to the main navigation. That big black bar in the middle, that's covering a baby's face. Here's a quick tip. If you have a baby on your website, you can immediately improve conversions by not covering its face. On top of that, the content within that black bar just wasn't robust. You can see it's just one sentence, and again, it's not as very useful. So all we did, didn't take much creativity, we just reduced some friction. We saw a 19.3% increase in total conversions between live chat and form fill-outs. All we did was remove some stuff, and we showed baby's face. Did you guys even notice the CTAs on the previous slide? A lot of people probably didn't, and obviously their users weren't either. All we did was reduce some friction, made those a little more prominent, reorganized some things, and we saw an increase. Imagine the iterations that'll come after this to actually use our creativity a little bit. So that's an example of reducing friction. Now I'm going to talk about adding friction. Specifically, the first part is adding friction to manipulate. I'm going to sound like a little bit of a crackpot here in a minute, but you need to understand that there's a darker side to everything that I'm talking about here today. There are designers out there who know what I know, who are actively designing for conversions, some of them in this room maybe, just kidding, not you, who are actively designing for conversions, and they're also actively deciding whether to and how manipulate you on your next experience with their platform. First example, extending time to increase credibility. So let's call this the lazy employee, and we're all a little bit guilty of this. Sometimes employees will inflate the amount of time that they're working to make it look like they're working extra. Oh my gosh, Alex worked till 8 o'clock last night. We should talk about that promotion for him. In reality, Alex was watching Bob's Burgers and drinking a beer. Great example of how some people will extend time to improve their credibility. Sometimes, speakers will engage with long pauses to increase the anticipation and impact of what they're about to say. Politicians do this. Comedians do this in a good way. All that they are doing is pausing. The next example is adding friction to manipulate for leads. Trigger warning, this is a trigger for me. And it's not the pop-up. Like the slide ups are cool, full page takeovers, whatever, not a big deal. It's what these say when you look a little bit closer. There are two types of friction here. You see this all over the internet. The first type of friction is the design friction. There is a wild favorability from a design perspective given to the opt-in option, while they are actively trying to hide the opt-out option. Ethically, you should give equal treatment to both if you cared about your customers. This is not sustainable. Users catch on to things like this, native advertising, banner ads, and when they do catch on to it, it creates a very poor association with your brand. Now remember, we are in the era of calling people out. So let's call some people out, shall we? Opt-in monster. No thanks, I'm fine with losing customers. Here's a good gauge before we get into the other ones. If something like this comes up and you're thinking about pushing it live to your site, pretend that you're talking to a customer and you're saying this out loud in person. Hi, would you like to increase your conversions? Or are you fine with losing customers? If you feel like that person might punch you in the face, do not put it on your website. Optinmonster.com. What's another one? UltimatePaleoGuide.com. No thanks. I know everything already. The next one's a little disappointing. Refinery29. Nah, I still think my money's taboo. SEM per plugins. No thanks. I don't want better SEO. MyMedic.us. No. I don't want to stay alive. And yes, this is so ridiculous that it's humorous. But keep in mind, what MyMedic.us is saying here is that if you don't want our notifications, you must want to die. When a brand does this, in the user's eyes, it makes the user feel like they don't give a fuck about you. Cussing is also a great way to add friction to improve an experience, but it can also get you in trouble. Luckily, awesome genius brands like SIC know that cussing is okay sometimes. So let's go on a more positive note. How about adding friction to improve an experience? This is my favorite example of adding friction, absolute favorite example. Magic. Magicians are the masters of adding friction to improve an experience. They have all these distractions going on with the sleight of hand and hiding things up their sleeves, while all in the background they're doing something that's going to amaze you. And we love it. We get so much entertainment out of it. This is an awesome example of adding friction to improve an experience, a pleasant surprise. Another example of adding friction to improve an experience is to improve your security. This is the point of a two-step verification, and this is the reason that when you're switching between some apps, banking apps will black out what the content is there. They're not trying to annoy you, they're trying to help you. They care about you. Another example of adding friction to improve an experience, preventing user errors. We've all seen this, we see it all the time. You try to close something without saving it, it comes up and it says, are you sure you want to close that without saving? This is created to help improve our experience. Here's an example. So if I'm hanging out with Colin over here, And I say to Colin, I'm going to jump off this bridge. Hopefully, Colin will say, are you sure you want to jump off that bridge? So that's a great way to think about it when you're designing. So if your user is about to take a high-risk action or an irreversible action, give them some friction to make sure that they understand what they're about to do. Another example is Slack again. So if you try to send a message to everyone in Slack, it'll warn you, hey, you're about to send this to 59 people. Are you sure you want to send that? So you better take a closer look at what you're about to say. What did I say? Yeah, I probably don't want to send that to 59 people. Drinks are not on me. That's a lot of friction in my wallet. So if there's one thing that we've talked about today, there's one thing that I want you to remember. It's to be an active skeptic. And I have the camera here because this is the only slide I think you really need to take a picture of, because this is the thing I want you to remember the most. What is this? Why is it here? And this is the new step. Does it make the experience better or worse? If it makes it better, great. Apply that same concept or principle to the designs that you're going to be creating. If it makes the experience worse, reach out. Again, what's the worst that can happen? We want to help each other. We want to help other designers see the friction that we see. But you do yourself a disservice if you are constantly wearing the active skeptic hat. Because while you're being an active skeptic, you cannot enjoy anything. You really can't. Like I said, when we're having a baby, we're having a daughter, and hopefully one day in the future, I want to watch her play a basketball game, and I want to enjoy that. If I'm being an active skeptic during that, all I'm doing is thinking about how horrible of a job the refs are doing. Why is no one else passing her the ball? Maybe I even start to be an active skeptic about her specifically. A great way to know when to take this active skeptic hat off and on is to think about how it will affect the people around you. How it will affect, am I supposed to be enjoying this moment right now? Or is this something that there's value of me being an active skeptic? So I'm going to end this talk a little bit differently. So usually, oh, okay, that is irrelevant. That has nothing to do with what I'm about to say. Let's go ahead and eat that. Okay. Usually at the end of a talk, we'll relieve the tension that we've been building this whole time. We'll usually do this with like a witty tagline or a basic insight that you can take home. But I want every single person in here to hold on to the tension we've built today. I want you to hold on to it until the next time you come across friction, or the next time friction comes across you. And I want you to ask yourself, what is this? Why is it here? Does that make the experience better or worse? If it makes it better, learn from it. Use that concept in the future of your designs. If it makes the experience worse, reach out. What is the worst that can happen? Okay, you reach out, they ignore you. Big deal. They go on giving shitty experiences while your life is no different. But what about the alternative? What if they listen to you? What if they listen to you and then implement your idea? Hell, what if they give you a job? What if they pay you money? You become that person off the street who changed the world for their users and probably changed the way that they think about design and the way that they think about friction. That's when you can let that tension break. That's when you're going to get your payoff, and that's when it's going to feel really good. But once it breaks, enjoy it, because you're going to want to let that tension build right back up for the next time friction finds you. Thank you.